Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everybody who's here, and I imagine we'll have people trickling in during the next hour and 40 minutes or so that we're going to be on this. As you know, we had two different two different sessions of talks on fire and invasives. A lot of fodder for discussion. So Becky and I thought it'd be useful to have this fire circle to kind of debrief on it and provide opportunity for more discussion about the talks. The way we're going to structure this is we're going to start off the beginning, open-ended brainstorming, discussing any topics, observations, comments, anything you might want to bring to the table to discuss. And then the middle to latter part of our time slot, we'll focus more specifically on this state of science document that we're trying to develop on the topic of joint management of fire invasives. We'll have some slides and some draft outline to share with you at that point. And so we'll have more specific input on that maybe after the next 20 minutes or so. You want to add anything, Becky?
Nope, I think you got it covered, Matt. It's great to see everyone.
Yes. Yeah, you can turn your cameras on if you'd like, because I think that there's 20 of us now. Okay, that's good. It's growing. First thing, I just want to open up the floor. Were there any comments, discussion items, anything you want to bring to the table for this discussion group relative to what you saw the last couple of days regarding fire and invasives? I think anybody can just unmute and talk if they like.
Any unanswered questions? Things you would have liked to have seen more of? Issues, concerns? Quiet group this morning.
I have some. If nobody wants to chime in. One of them is there's quite a bit of discussion about what should, like for example, in developing a state of science summary, what should constitute an invasive species? Should it include species that are not native to the United States or North America? Should it include species that are just out of place within North America? Things like native juniper, obviously, is a good example. Anybody have any strong opinions on that?
Go ahead, Amy.
Oh, well, I think there's two ways to look at it, is that woody encroachment might be its own topic, woody encroachment being that specifically of natives or species that are native to a region, but perhaps not as large of a component of the specific vegetation type that they are now in because of fire suppression. So that could just say that, you know, that's a different topic. Or we could treat it like I think a lot of managers do and include those in our realm of, or in our scope.
Yeah,
I would say like at least like make that distinction in, if we were to write like some kind of paper talking about the state of science, like make sure that that is like a clear distinction, or at least acknowledge those kind of different conceptual ideas of what they are.
I think we have a few hands up. I'm not sure. I think Lindy's hand came up first.
Morning, you guys. This is something I guess I feel strongly about the way you worded it. We went through the same discussion when we worked on the Department of Interior Science Framework and some of the other documents where we're trying to basically, like the person just said a minute ago, we did separate them. They had their own chapter for conifer encroachment compared to the invasives. I think a lot of us that work heavily in the invasives field just get concerned that we're diluting the issue. And if we start talking about native species that are, whether you want to call it succession with range expansion and climate change or whatever, if we start tying it to that, then is leadership and asking for funding going to think that, everything's fair game? So again, it kind of dilutes the focus. And if we want to really continue this message of highlighting the invasives aspect and that economic and human health impact, I would just feel strongly that we keep it to that definition of the invasives in the executive order. But even like in some of the notes in our emails, the executive order could be interpreted differently, but to keep it to the strictest definition of invasives in that sense.
Yeah, the executive order, both the Clinton and the more recent one, have basically stayed outside of their ecosystem.
Right, I know.
So the definition is, what do you mean by ecosystem?
Right.
Coastal sage scrub next to chaparral, two different ecosystems, or is it bioregions? So the executive order actually leaves things kind of open. I think that the other part of it is thinking about if helping in guide land management is, what are the directives that the land management is under? So for example, I wonder, maybe Greg, you had your hand up next, maybe the EPMT teams for the Park Service, can they control juniper? Do they? Or are they just focused on species listed in invasive species lists of?
Yeah, I think Luke was ahead of me, but I will just, I am not sure. I suspect that they're now called the IPMTs. I get corrected all the time. Invasive.
Okay.
I suspect that they do not, just because they're usually tasked with, really high priority, really aggressive, I'd say the non-North American invasives. But again, one thing I didn't develop as clearly as I might have yesterday is that, they're kind of beholden to each park in terms of what the park priority is. So there's, that's the thing. I'd have to go make 20 phone calls to see how they're approaching some of those. But I'd say in general, they are dealing with the Eurasian invaders. And if I could just add that the way I've always looked at that particular issue from when I started this job 20 years ago, I always thought about, well, how does it influence the management response? And I always felt that if you're looking at some of these things that are just looking at, just like we do with overabundant native ungulates, right? Like, what are the processes, the natural, quote unquote, natural ecosystem processes that are out of whack that you might want to say, how do we adjust for that before we start, thinking about this is a major issue. We got to come in with lots of herbicides and this, that, and the other, versus just kind of tweaking some of the management practices with the idea of, at the time, part of my job was to really try to get that message across to a lot of natural resource managers and parks that no, fire is a natural process. You got to think about how to get it back in there. But things are changing too, right? I think part of it is the question of how is this all blending with climate change, and how are all these forces coming together to push us away from whatever that condition is we think we can manage that's mostly native.
Yeah. Luke?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Greg, in terms of thinking about problematic species and what are the interactions of interest. But I do think it's really important to be careful with terminology and not just to use the same term such as invasive and then just make it more encompassing to fit our needs. I think instead, I think we should stick with an ecological definition, one of Ricciardi's or Richardson's or something. But then if you want to include weedy and invasive species, and whereas weedy could be any problematic species, whether it's native or not, it's not where you want it to be, woody encroachment or whatever, then that's fine, as long as it's defined up front, like Adam said. I think in some cases, incorporating all of those species, regardless of ecosystem or biome boundaries or whatever you want to say, is important in terms of interactions. But I don't think it's a good idea to muddle the definition of what is invasive.
Yeah, I generally speaking, especially considering the species that are dealt with in these wet east of the Rockies, a lot of them are native to North America and out of place. And I think that to be most useful to the wide range of situations in the United States, we don't want to limit ourselves. I don't think that though also then, like what Lindy was saying, dilutes sort of the reason. I mean, I think we can provide examples in different sections, like in a discussion in the East, they're going to be talking a lot about species that are native to North America but are the management issues over there. And so I think that it's important to be able to accommodate that, but our semantics need to be very careful and precise so that we are clear in what we're talking about, so there is not any confusion, you know, kind of like what Lindy was cautioning to. Doug, I think you're next.
Yeah, thanks. I generally agree with everything that's been said. I think it's important to make a clear distinction and make that distinction up front. And I think that, you know, there's a potential for a lot of confusion if we include, for instance, juniper in a sort of broader, less well-defined category, but there's going to be an opportunity to address those interactions in each chapter. So we can still talk about how, you know, woody encroachment, for instance, might have an influence on the more specific, you know, alien exotic species, fire interactions that we're addressing in each chapter. So it's not like these issues have to be ignored. They can be addressed, you know, through those interactions.
Michelle?
So I would agree as well. And with everything that has been said, I definitely agree with what Lindy has said in terms of being very cautious and very careful. You know, one thing with the alien, you know, the non-native species and being able to focus in on that is, you know, most of our land managers don't always, you know, they end up falling to, if you include a very broad definition, they will fall to their default in terms of what they have been managing. So I think with this chapter, you know, it's an opportunity to really highlight those alien species that are having a strong effect on fire regimes one way or another. And so I think it's incredibly important that we do focus on that for this particular book. Also, I could see in the future is if we do have a very broad definition in terms of native species that might be, quote, invading, under climate regimes and species trying to move and find new niches and whatnot, you know, in some cases we need to be allowing that to happen. And I would be slightly concerned that managers may call them invaders rather than trying to adapt, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it seems like, again, east of the Rockies more so, a lot of that's already within the management context. Those are the species that are already considered invaders. And because if you go to the harm part, because they're causing in that context what's considered ecological or economic harm. So it's a frame. I mean, our context in the West is different than the East, and basically east of the Rockies, it seems to me. And I think it's important to try to present, you know, maybe more focus a lot on processes of the interactions, so that when managers say, hey, I got this species, but there's nothing in the literature on it, how do I manage it in the context of fire? It's something out of place. And maybe they go to, okay, it's this life form and it's invading this species, this landscape of this other dominant life form. Ask the question, what's its potential to be an ecosystem transformer? I'm starting to think that in part one, we need a chapter on just these things about woody species invading grasslands and grassland species invading woody dominated landscapes, and talking more about the general framework of what are the characteristics of ecosystem transformers, and just use species as examples, but focus more on the processes so that it becomes more universal. And frankly, anybody around the world could potentially use it. So I think probably we want to have some element of that in this publication to be able to be more nimble and apply in more situations, not just people looking up in the index where, say, cheatgrass occurs in the book and going around the book to find information about cheatgrass.
Yeah, and being able to make the distinction, like, for instance, we had a lot of insect outbreaks, in our forested systems in the West, and those were native species. And, some people view that as, a threat, whereas others viewed it as setting the stage for, for climate change and potential for, changes in our ecosystems and our vegetation types. So it's, yeah, I think we have to walk that line for sure.
Yeah. Well, and the other part of the climate change context is, in certain situations, are we really kind of have to manage for those quote unquote designer landscapes in situations where local realize, hey, this place is so disrupted already. This is what's the only thing probably that's realistic. And then provide maybe the publication provide tools for those people too. So there's a wide range of situations. Unfortunately, that seems to be becoming more and more prevalent. That's that situation.
Yeah, and really making the distinction between what is the threat. In here, I'm just going to go back to a forested ecosystem. White pine blister rust. That was introduced here. So it's these introductions that are the threat.
Yeah. Adam, you had your hand up and then I saw you disappear. Do you still want to?
Yeah, sure. I might be
for
kind of being redundant here, but I was just kind of thinking about the general function and the general process. And I feel like a lot of like the native invasives, quote unquote, are kind of almost the natural result of humans just like screwing everything up, basically, to use layman's terms. And then but then there's also these invasive plants where they have overcome biogeographic barriers, and then they're kind of like just growing out of control because of enemy release and all these other different mechanisms by which origin effects kind of are realized. And so it's kind of, to me, there's kind of like two groups of like how it all works, and then of course there's like combinations of the two when you have like something like cheatgrass being introduced and then grazing kind of opening up the pathway for it to establish in the crust or whatever. So yeah, I guess that's kind of the point that I was wanting to bring up.
So just jump in real quick. Maybe early on, there just needs to be a discussion of these interrelated topics and all the nuances that are involved in each, so that we can clearly define, what this volume is and what it isn't.
Yeah, that would have to be dealt
no
with.
misconceptions, right from the get-go. And some of these
So our terminology
are
is
going to work.
consistent.
Sorry.
Oh, and so our terminology is consistent.
Exactly.
So
Right.
things are defined. We can talk
Exactly.
about all these things as long as we're talking about them the same way.
Yeah, and we can work some of these themes into the subsequent chapters, but it's defined up front, which are front and center, which are the topics we're our primary objectives to address, and which sort of processes or dynamics are related and will be brought into the story, but not necessarily the key focus of this particular volume.
And I think too, like the understanding the fundamental like root cause of some of these things really gets at like what you do about it too, with the example of like, woody encroachment of prairies by juniper is like you just reintroduce fire, maybe is kind of, you get it back to the natural disturbance regime, whereas that's not really, you don't really have that same idea of just trying to get things back to normal with something like knapweed invasion or something like that.
you think it would be worthwhile to kind of have a, to come up with a little bit of a framework, like we were just discussing, and that to make sure that as we talk about species and issues, that we then kind of tier to that common framework?
Yes. Yes.
And I think Stas has his hand up.
Yeah, I think, you know, in reference, I think we're all kind of talking around a little bit about this publication, is that it needs to be sort of approached sequentially, and there needs to be some universal information that all the chapter authors would reference and utilize set up front.
Yeah.
Another example for when I was part of the 2 California fire books that were published by UC Press, and one of the things we did really early on is there was this massive matrix of all the species that would potentially be dealt with, and which chapters or bioregional chapters would deal with them primarily. Because so cheatgrass would be a good example, right? Bioregionally, we probably ought to have one of those chapters really deal with, probably be the desert chapter, cheatgrass in depth, and then other chapters can reference it and then only include in their bioregion how it might operate or, you know, differently there. That's just one, that's an obvious example. But same thing would go for, you know, terminology as well as conceptual stuff about scope. That's all the sort of stuff which somewhere in part 1 would need to be. And this is kind of begging us to kind of hand off to going over this outline. Do we want to go ahead and do that now? I think maybe it's time. I have some slides I can share to kind of guide that discussion.
Does Stas still want to say something?
I was just gonna, you know, first sort of, I think it was Doug's suggestion in terms of that sort of conceptual kind of framing at the beginning in terms of what the, you know, what the issues are. And I certainly support using the definition from the latest executive order, but recognizing that, you know, the situation isn't that cut and dried. And I just wanted to note that this whole question on kind of the neonatives versus invasives is something that we have raised within the National Invasive Species Council in the past and haven't gotten traction on, but we've got sort of another, you know, we'll likely be working on it more coming in next year. And it's discussions like this that kind of inform the need in terms of how do we think about it from, you know, a broader sort of policy and leadership level. So I think if, you know, this process sort of sticks to kind of the strict definitions, but sort of recognizes that the broader sets of issues with woody encroachment, that is something that we can also sort of address from the other discussions that we're having with the NISP member agencies.
Yeah, to me, the language in the executive order, I'm guessing, maybe you know more, was purposefully vague in terms of that concept of in relationship to a species occurring in an ecosystem, it's not native to that ecosystem. I mean, again, ecosystem is a non-specific term. It's used at different scales, I'll say. And so I think that still fits what we're talking about and allows us to apply it in those different ways within, to meet all the needs of the East and the West, I guess.
Yeah, agreed. I think it was kind of vague, given that you're looking, you know, different agencies, different sort of users are looking at it from different perspectives, and rather than having, you know, trying to split the line too finely, that was kind of the agreed upon language.
Because I think if I remember back to 77 and Carter, it was North America or the United States, right?
I think so.
I think that was the language originally, not native to the United States or North America. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share this just so we can kind of work through this here. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Cool. Okay. So important to understand, this outline's currently in draft form, very draft form. So the purpose of this is to get information, additional information. This is probably version 4 over the last couple months of this. And we're definitely seeking feedback from a wide range of people right now. So this is the scope that we've been kind of talking around. Audience, geography, taxonomy, that's what we've been focusing on. I just want to say here, this is basically the language from the recent executive order for the most part. It's paraphrased a little bit. But basically non-native with respect to a particular ecosystem and occurring outside of its natural range. Again, whatever natural is, I guess natural / historical. It's broad, right? And so I think that in the introduction, we present this and we then say that this can be considered applied at different scales and is often considered at different scales in different regions of the United States. Do we want to talk any more about this right now, or do you want to talk about a couple of these other things? We want to move on?
I think we should move on because I feel like the taxonomic scope, we could like probably talk about it endlessly.
Yes. So here's a good one. The first two, I think we have pretty good agreement that this is what our primary focus is in terms of focus. And this group down here, which are very different, they require different modalities and all that sort of thing to transfer information. But they're also within the, I put them in, originally I had, we had academics and researchers, the number 4 of these. I mean, one of the things we have to consider is that in trying to get a publisher to publish this, they're going to need an audience. They're going to need people to purchase the thing. So this is part of our prospectus, essentially. Does anybody have any comments or thoughts on scope of this book and whether in particular number 1 and 2 are the appropriate primary focus?
The only thing that came up with me is when I saw Puerto Rico on there, I was thinking, gosh, it's hard. What exactly are the issues in Puerto Rico? The previous 2008 volume doesn't have the words. I don't know if they actually, I've been there. I don't know if they actually have fire invasive problems. From what I found, they do have plenty of invasives, but the research at least regarding that's not clear to me at this point.
And I think the reason why this is our starting point is because for me, past treatments have been so Western focused, and we're now, it's awesome that like in this session, there's been more participation in particular from the Great Plains on East than anything on this topic than I've been involved in before, which is fantastic. But then it also got me thinking, well, what about these other, if we're talking about the United States, why not be as inclusive as possible? Maybe some of the processes and ecoregions are similar to, Southern Florida, perhaps, and that could be included. But this is only in the interest of being inclusive as inclusive as we can. There may be no information, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to make sure that what we produce might be applicable in those areas that are like, same thing for the Pacific territories. We can say Hawaii, but then, USGS has a whole Pacific Island Ecosystem Center that deals with all across these territories. I'm hoping that maybe we can engage some of those folks. Forest Service, I think, does too. And engage those folks to provide some input there.
And if some of these areas don't have like the content, maybe for a whole chapter, maybe we can like try to think about combining things if there's not a lot of science to really yard up on the topic.
Yep. And I think sometimes when you do a treatment like a book chapter on these areas, I mean, Hawaii would be the exclusion, but these other areas, and you basically say, hey, we don't have a whole lot of information, but here's what we think is probably the processes and issues. It stimulates people to go study there and get information. And then 10 years later, you have some of that information. So I think it probably makes sense, especially also too, since we say federal and private land managers or public and private land managers, but a lot of what this is driving is sort of at the national scale, and we want to make, I don't know, I kind of feel like we should be as inclusive as we can be.
Could we talk a little bit about audience, Matt?
Yep.
You know, we have public and private land managers listed first here, which obviously sets a tone for how things are written.
Yeah.
Not everyone is successful at achieving that. I'm wondering, have we thought about engaging like any maybe boundary spanners or tech transfer specialists to help with that piece?
In terms of language and presentation,
Yeah.
getting a scientist to not write scientifically.
Something
I know
like
what you're
that.
talking about. I know what you're talking about.
I'm talking about.
Or at least not overdo it.
Exactly. Like,
Yeah.
I think
yeah.
it's a very good point. I think it needs to. I think that each of the co-authors that manage a subset of chapters, because we're going to have to break up sort of the duties of overseeing chapters. We will all need to try to help push for this sort of language as they see needed for, you know, some chapters that might be too scientific-y, whatever that means, you know what I mean. But it's not a bad idea. I mean, we could engage somebody that might do a seminar for all of our authors, perhaps. I'm trying to figure out how that would, how
we do it.
How we would actually get that person to then interact with 16 authors, 16 chapters, whatever the number is going to be.
Yeah.
Give them tools and things to think about before they sit down to put pen to paper.
Well, yeah, I was thinking about the potential for engaging the Joint Fire Science Fire Exchange Network, which is regionally focused and might be able to engage, certainly might be able to at least possibly put on a webinar, but it's just an idea. I haven't.
What about having them be one of the reviewers?
Yeah, that's an idea.
Have each of the chapters reviewed by somebody that's going to, with an eye towards what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Or language. None of that actually might be, I think maybe something on the front end, but then somewhere in the review process. I mean,
Yeah.
we can do that, but especially those that their job is information transfer, tech transfer. I think that's not a bad idea.
Another thing they might be able to help with is like graphics that are really catchy and cool. So
yeah, one thing that we probably will need is to probably have a dedicated person to produce graphics.
Yeah.
I know we did that with the California Fire book, and it was an almost full-time person for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And so that is a reality, yes, that I think that's probably something which we might need to look for some resources to support. I don't think that's going to be difficult to find the resources to support that, but finding the person that would be willing to stay with us for a couple of years in this process or whatever it's going to take. Yeah. How about, well, fire management scope, invasive species scope. I threw them there because I feel like we need to make sure there's a touchstone that we're dealing with all, and these might not be the exact things to say here, but basically make sure we're addressing all phases of both fire management and invasive species management. This also brings up another topic, which I think I threw out to some of the authors maybe yesterday, was this idea that pretty much all the stuff we summarized so far, and when I do these fire and invasive modules at NAFRI for fire and ecosystem management course and whatnot, I'm talking to fire managers because that's those are fire managers. And a lot of stuff we write is tailored towards fire managers. So it's educating fire managers about invasive species issues. We have to also, I think about making sure that this is something that invasive species managers can use too, that's speaking their language. I think if we had to choose one or the other, it's probably more important to do the fire management side, if for only because that's where most of the resources are to do things, aka funding. But
We have a few hands up here, I think.
oh, good. I'm glad you're watching that because I'm not watching that. Why don't you go ahead and call those off, Becky? So you can.
I am not sure who was first, but I'm going to, I see Doug's hand is up.
Yeah, I just had a couple of thoughts that based on some earlier conversation. So in terms of that audience and the issue of addressing a public land manager audience as well as academics or scientists, just one thought quickly would be to make sure there's some sort of a set of key points or a take-home message for land managers in many of the chapters as a way to sort of allow ourselves to write scientifically to get the information across in an effective way for scientists, but also distill it down into, I don't know, if it'd be like a cutout or a summary or something. For
really good idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Just so that it's clear that for managers, you don't have to read through all of the technical jargon. If you really want the key points, go here. And then the other thought I had was just about the geographic scope. I don't want to get into too many, side conversations here, but clearly for some of these ecoregions, the Great Plains, the northern forests, the warm deserts, a good portion of those are in Canada or Mexico or whatever. And in many cases, there's going to be quite a bit of literature that might be relevant. I'm perfectly okay with, and I understand the practicality and the logistics and the need to maybe limit it to the 50 states, but just pointing out that, there's going to be this broader scientific body of literature that we might want to make sure that we're considering, even if it isn't the focus of the geographic scope overall.
Yeah, I don't think we limit authors to the United States by any means. I think if they're drawn from other areas outside the United States, I think that we leave it to the authors to make sure that they are relevant to what's going on in the United States. And if there has to be if it's from South Africa, probably should explain why it's relevant. If it's from Canada or Mexico, maybe not so much. However, those are really good points, Doug. And I don't think we limit ourselves in terms of the science.
I figured as much.
We're focusing on application within management
and management issues here in the US.
Yep.
Sure. Fair enough.
I love your idea about a text box take-home messages, because that gets at when Mike Lusk and I did this handbook for the Fish and Wildlife Service a while ago. One of the reviewers came back because I wanted to make sure that there were some citations so that it had some sort of quote unquote gold standard in terms of standing up to help managers lean on. And the one sentence review I got was, this reads like a dissertation. And so basically saying, don't put any citations at all. So I think having those call out boxes, one for each maybe bioregion about take home messages for management, is a great idea. It's almost like having an executive summary for each chapter.
I think Jacqueline on?
Yeah, hey, it's Jackie Ott. I was co-author with Amy Simstad on the Great Plains chapter, and I was just wondering about, in 2008, it was a GTR that was published, and we're moving towards a book, but if our primary audience is reaching those land managers, how accessible is that book going to be to them? And what your thoughts were about that, and if there's like an interim, we have a book, but we also have like a GTR type product that's freely accessible, and just interested in your thoughts on that.
That's a really good idea. I've thought about that too, because this book will probably be pricey. One thing that it's tricky because publishers are going to want to make money, and they're not going to want to have some alternative summary out there. But there are ways to work with publishers where if you put something up front financially, you can buy rights and to have summaries like that. So you could potentially publish a GTR executive summary, perhaps, of sort of a collection of take-home messages. and a publisher would still be okay. That would be a part of negotiation with the publisher. But I think that there's a way. The reason why I think it's a good idea to do the book, because I think we also want to make this widely available worldwide, because there isn't anything like it, to tell you the truth. I mean, there's a lot of science around the world, and there's a lot of what we're doing, like in Australia and South Africa, being done in particular. However, you know, not a compilation like we're talking about. So even though you know, other countries is not in our audience scope, that's still kind of in my mind. If we're going to put all this in, I think it would be useful in that range. And so it gets indexed more widely too. GTRs tend to be hard for people to find. Used to be. Nowadays it's less difficult. But that's a very good point, though. We would want to make sure. I mean, one thing I think we've done in the past with books is we've also had the funding to buy a whole bunch of them and ship them out to the managers. We do that with GTRs too. It's cheaper with GTRs, but that's something else that we can do too for initial, you know, sending them all out there. So very good point, though. Something we need to keep in mind.
I think Michelle was next.
So yeah, I actually had some similar questions that Jackie did in terms of accessibility to the book, because I will say that a lot of land managers probably won't just go out and buy it because it came out, and or maybe even a lot of people, they won't buy it or even consider it until they actually need it. And typically with these land managers, when they need it is when they do a NEPA analysis. So they won't read it until they actually need to apply whatever may be in the book. So I agree with Jackie that we need to make it as accessible and as free as possible. And that gets back sort of to, you know, who's your audience, being able to make the book available to who your audience is. And for your audience scope, I mean, when I'm looking at what you have listed here, I would just go with public, private land managers and policymakers and staff. Any student aspiring to be a land manager is going to read it. So I think I would just limit that audience scope just to those people. And then with that, I know a lot of nonprofits do this, where they will take sort of that book or the report or publication, but they work with technical editors that they contract out with to make the language more user-friendly and more readable. And I think that might be a really good idea, is having some of those, you know, that technical editor type that comes in and just reads through all the chapters. It makes it much more reader friendly for a general public. Otherwise it will come across as just a science document.
Yeah. First point, if I remember the California Fire book, UC Press embargoed everything for about 6 months, but then we could send individual chapters out as PDFs. So for example, if somebody's working in the desert, the Great Basin or Mount West, after 6 months or so, the publication comes out, we could then send them the desert chapter. They may only want the desert chapter. So that's—
I didn't think they could do any embargoing ever of a government author on something.
Yeah. So anyways, the forgot what your middle one was, but the last point, the technical editor, it's a very good idea. The challenge is finding one that understands fire and invasive species concepts, and because I did that, I've done that in the past, and what I got back was changed so much that it wasn't correct. So that's a challenge. So if we have somebody that's in the fire field or the invasives field at the very least that understands it well, then that could work really well. Yeah.
I think we have some other hands out there. Travis and then Stas.
Michelle, can you say again who you thought your scope would be in the limited scope?
Oh, yeah, in the audience scope. So, I mean, I would just limit it to your public, and private land managers, your policy makers, and just, kind of staff, anyone that tends to manage lands, like public or private lands at a bigger scope. Because I think, you have listed in there students, and, students are going to read it regardless. I mean, if they're aspiring to be a public land manager, they're going to read it. And then where you have the general public, the general public, I don't know that they will.
Yeah.
That's
what I'm thinking about it
at Barnes and Noble, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that was kind of my thinking too. But it seems that by having the public land managers and students who want to be land managers that language to me says make it accessible, like we've talked about with these breakout things. And policymakers and staff would almost be grouped in with that group too, because it has to be accessible. And so I'm seeing this more and more as just two big groupings, would be like academics and researchers are together as they can handle jargon and scientific graphs and data analyses. And then we need this distilled group for land managers, students who want to be land managers, and policymakers, and maybe just de-emphasize and list and it would be great. We've written it in an accessible way so that the general public could pick it up. But I don't think we're targeting it to them. I think that would be a totally different kind of book.
Yeah.
So yeah, it sounds like we might be talking about changing some of that. But I think right now it's listed as 3 things, but the third one, academics, policymakers, and public, seem like a really disjointed grouping in terms of accessibility. And so I would just suggest that we group them more and thinking about it in terms of what's the goal, where does it need to be really accessible, and where does it need to be technical.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things here. Our writing focus is numbers 1 and 2. And but then when you put a prospectus together for a publisher, they want to know their marketing. They want to know the marketing scope. And I would think it'd be smart for us to say, yeah, be used in an upper division undergraduate course, for example, because they're going to want to know who's going to buy it. So there's 2 things we're talking about here that I've kind of combined into one. I think we all agree that, or maybe I'll ask the question, or anybody can dissent. Our audience are public and private land managers and students that are aspiring to be so. I think that is what we're trying to primarily focus on, I believe. And so
I think that, yeah, that's a good point, Matt. And I want to get to the other hands, but one thing I want to interject in this conversation around public and private land managers is I think a really important audience is fire and fuel managers. And it's a little bit of a different training and focus than what we think of as, say, like an invasive plant manager or a range con or something. And so I think we might want to be more specific about that to get into our thinking.
Is that better? Whoops. Fire and invasive plant manager.
Yeah, I think that's really good.
That's a very good point.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a very good point.
And I think we wanted to get to Stas and then Greg.
Yeah, thanks. And agree with the discussion on audience scope. I just want to highlight, I think earlier this year, a bunch of editors from the Forest Service put out a book on invasive species in forests and rangelands of the US, a comprehensive science synthesis for the US forest sector. And that was done through Springer, and you can download it for free. So, and Becky, you may have been involved in that process. So that might be one model to look at to see, what was entailed in terms of, making it readily downloadable, but for folks who want a hard copy, they can still buy it. So yeah. I'll put I
can ask Rob Progar and Toril about how that was done.
Cool.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm going to go down to the next topic here. We can start talking about content a little bit. This is the structure as it currently exists. We have 3 parts. The idea is we're going to set things up with the basic fundamental science and management realities, context, and we'll get into the weeds on each of these parts in subsequent slides here. and then talk about how they apply specifically in different bioregions, ecosystems, whatever we want to call them. And then have a section on sort of more specifics about integrating fire invasive plant management within, you know, different contexts of fire management, invasive species management. I throw sidebars in here. This is something which a lot of times are kind of useful. They could even be 1,000 words. They could be 1,200 words. They could be pretty significant. When we did the California Fire book, they were actually separately authored. They were embedded in chapters. So there was a piece on salt cedar and fire, ecology and management that had multiple citations and whatnot that was embedded in the desert chapter and was authored by a separate group of people. So that's somewhere where if there is something that really needs to be elaborated upon and stand apart, both visually and as well as maybe have some other authors contribute, that's a way of doing that. And then of course, stuff can be thrown into appendices too. So right now, this is kind of what we're thinking in terms of the structure. Want me to go into part 1 content now? Let's do it. Right here, this is right now where the current part 1 chapters are, the topics. Just enough wild and fire and invasive species principles to be able to carry us through the book. We don't have to repeat individual books on each of those topics that are each, you know, massive tomes. But I think that this is where we need to get commonalities about terminologies about fuels and fire behavior and fire regimes and invasive species, et cetera, so that there's a common language. And then more of sort of structural framework, conceptual models, basic foundations of how do fires affect invasive plants, so that then it can be drawn upon and talk more specifically in the context of each bioregion. We split out fuels, fire behavior, and fire regimes in the session between the West and the East, largely because a lot of the species and the different issues are sort of fundamentally different, or in terms of the numbers of things that are going on. A lot of more woody encroachment in the East and woody into woody areas, et cetera, different sort of dynamics. And then there was a question about, a lot of people brought up the topic of the context of climate change. I think the context of land use is an important one too. Right now, we're kind of having a discussion about maybe having the context of land use, like for example, managing fire and invasives in the context of multiple use lands. It's an important reality. Is it something we as a separate chapter? It's a question. And then in particular, the context of climate change, potential future non-analogs. Is what we know about fire and invasives going to change likely substantially, even processes, even fundamentally in the future? Restoration treatments that work now under potential non-analog future climates, what are the potential for them working then? A lot of this stuff, it's basically the fundamental science that we feel is needed to underpin the bioregional approach parts in part 2, as well as the management stuff in part 3. So I'll leave it open. Any comments on this section?
I'll comment and ask about the management challenges posed by land use and climate change, and how that belongs here apart from part 3, which maybe we can get to when we get to part 3. But part 3 seemed to me to be a little more. It says in the title management, so I'm wondering.
I guess it seemed like there's been some discussion about the need for some basic information about how based on current science, how do we think potential future climates might affect the interactions between fire and invasives? And then in the maybe the title here is not the right title, management challenges, maybe more like challenges posed or potential future interactions of climate with these. So this is more the basic fundamental science of what we think might happen in terms of the processes. On the back end in part 3, it'd be more about how they would apply to fuels, potentially fuels management, and how they apply to fire suppression, how they might apply to how we might manage post-fire landscapes. It's something which is going to be woven throughout the chapters, but it seemed like there was a desire to have some of the fundamental science put up front and then revisited on the back end in terms of management. So yeah, I think that the semantics here are probably not correct. We probably won't want to, it's probably going to be more about, you know, potential future climate and land use patterns, you know, how they might impact fire management, fire and invasive species interactions. There we go. Something along those lines.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah.
Maybe this is in part 2, but so what about those policy challenges? You know, we have policy challenges based on some of the facts of how these things interact, and then we have a policy challenge, and we want to talk about, are we going to try to capture those as well and possibly solutions? Or...
Yeah, so part 3.
Okay.
This is the outline for part 3. And right now, this is the first chapter. So it kind of is meant to set the stage for what are the cultures and policies, and I threw practices in there. I'm not quite sure it's grab bag, but really cultures and policies that define fire and species management, and what are, you know, and sometimes create barriers to integration, and sometimes provide opportunities for crosswalk. So I think that may be what your question is addressing. Where does that fit?
Yes.
Yeah. So that sets the stage for the rest of what we're talking about in part 3.
Okay, perfect.
So the basic science, I mean, I guess one question is, are we missing any major component of fundamental science that's really needed to kind of provide some common language, terminology, et cetera, for the rest?
The only thing I was thinking about is like our earlier discussions that kind of, I think there was someone in the chat who might have put this in it, and Doug might have mentioned it too, kind of the focus on ecosystem transformers as kind of, I mean, it's woven throughout all of this, but we don't specifically have, like, we're not specifically calling that out anywhere.
Yeah, perhaps in the introduction, I mean, there's going to be, I think that there's a need for a chapter 1 introduction before the part 1. And in that, some of the stuff about the definitions of what an invasive species is, the definitions of some of the key definitions, but then also talking about the interactions between the two at a very high level in terms of why are we concerned about these things? Well, we're concerned about them largely because of the transformations they occur, that they can potentially cause. So maybe in the introductory chapter, but maybe as a chapter in this part 1. I mean, I think it's a key concept, which especially would be useful for bioregional chapters to reference, because there's situations where it's clearly an ecosystem transformer and they can reference back to a previous chapter that explains what that means. But there may be other situations where we're not sure if it really meets this, but it's still a local management concern. And so in a particular area, a woody species invading a woody environment, for example, how much of an ecosystem transformer is it? And of course, I guess there's scales of degrees, I should say, of transformations too, that could be potentially occur. I think that's a concept we definitely need to have up front here, whether it's in part 1 or as part of the introduction, I think still remains a question.
Yeah, I think we have 2 hands up, or do we have more? Michelle, want to go ahead?
Sure. So I really think you should take, even though you may want to reword your management challenges posed by land use and climate change, I do think you want to include something along those lines as a chapter in part 3. That just kind of summarizes those overall management challenges that are posed by land use and climate change, including potential ways to manage for these challenges, you know, such as RAD, scenario planning, those types of ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, that could fit within this catch-all, but maybe there's something that needs to go right before this.
Yeah, or maybe change that to the other.
And let's keep in mind every chapter we suggest, we need to find someone to write it. Right?
It's very true.
I think Doug has his hand up.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, Becky, that needs to be in there somewhere fairly early, the landscape transformations that are occurring via native species, woody encroachment and so on. And I also think you could, with that last sort of chapter in part 1, the management challenges, which I understand may not be appropriately worded right now, but that's really kind of the context for the fact that we're looking at uncertain and dynamic futures, given changes in land use, climate change, shifting species distributions. It could be a pretty beefy chapter. I think we'd have to be a little cautious, but I think a lot of the themes overlap. It could be handled in that chapter. And then that very nicely sets the context for the subsequent chapters, that a lot of the science that we're presenting will have this additional consideration given these interactions between land use and species change and climate change and so on, and changing fire weather dynamics, all those things. So possibly in that last chapter in the first part, those topics sewn together. Just a suggestion. Just to throw this into the mix too, there's a lot of work on, projections that are coming out in the literature on specific fire regimes themselves as well. And there might be even an opportunity to point some of those. There's quite a bit. There's been an explosion of that in the literature lately. And of course, with more complex modeling capabilities, more ability to actually model, feedbacks and so on, and start to get a better handle on how these things might interact in the future. So.
So the bioregions we've identified. Any comments on these?
I asked you earlier about the inclusion of Hawaii. Actually, in the previous one, in the part that I'm leading on the Western US.
Yes.
So you want it there because it could just be covered thoroughly in this part here.
Yeah. Basically, you're talking about this one here.
Yeah.
If we feel that the big issues are related to grass fire cycles,
yeah,
it makes sense to throw it in there.
Okay.
Sort of as a process. That's something that is the big one in the West. Is the big one in the West as well as in Hawaii. I don't know about the other Pacific territories, so it kind of makes sense because again, I mean, we could potentially have a single chapter here on, more just like that conceptual model that you threw out there, Carla, in your presentation, which I think is the way to go to provide, but also the East, the issues are a lot different in terms of woody species. And so I think it's actually good to utilize that second one on the East could utilize your conceptual model, but then also maybe there's some additional foundational stuff that could be provided relative to other things that are more about woody species invading, woody encroachers that they could focus more on. So we'll have to talk about, if we want to keep those two chapters separate, which I think we do, about how to sort of have them work together really well and complement each other. Yeah. And then I think that these chapters would be addressing issues related to that's presented in part 1 in those two fire regime chapters.
Where are the Southwestern mountains fitting in?
Like Arizona.
They're not in our ecoregion.
I assume they'd fit into the North American desert, semi-arid highlands and.
That's what, these are the Arizona, New Mexico, Southern Utah. That's what these are. This terminology is the EPA ecoregion terminology.
Yeah, that's right, okay.
Yeah, and this probably would not be the title of this chapter.
Yeah.
It's their topics. Yeah. I mean, another question is, Northwestern forest right here is a question for Becky, includes pretty wide range. I mean, is it worthy to have a Northwestern forest geographically and then have more of an interior forest that would include maybe these things as well as the Colorado Plateau?
Well, that's when there is a lot of similarities in interior forests that would include those southwestern forests, especially, the dominance of ponderosa pine throughout most of those forests. So that is something to think about. Doug is doing the North American, the first.
The desert, yeah, Doug and I right now, but that's we could have more.
Yeah, maybe we could kind of talk about that more together.
Yeah, I think there's a scale kind of thing. So ecoregionally at EPA level 1 ecoregional levels or level 2 even, we could shift these things. But then when you're talking about sky islands within the desert, that's really in the context. Yeah. They're really so. But I think that the other question is the stuff, are the coastal forests versus the interior forests different enough that they should be treated separately? And they can be. I mean, these are things we can talk about.
Yeah. Well, they are. I would say they're like vastly different.
The management issues, they differ significantly. Yeah, I think maybe that's one way of looking at it. So,
but we don't have nearly as much of the data on the coastal forests, so it's not like a huge body of science to yard up. But I think we need to go to Greg and Amy.
Just real quick, would it make sense to just say you would be able to adjust this based on some initial solicitations of interest from authors? Well, what I'm getting at is I suspect there could be a lot of issues raised from the Southeast where it could be pulled out from northern and eastern forests. Just seems like a really big lump to me.
I agree.
And I'm not sure, Matt, you can correct me, but I don't see that the eastern issues being limited to woodies, but people can, that will reveal itself, but things like reed grass and Kogan grass and stuff like that. Anyway, what just jumped out is, Florida just jumps out. So
yeah, it does.
And I think, but as you start circulating this thing around, you'll start getting a feel for, we probably should dedicate something to Florida.
Luke Florida was on this, I don't know if he's still in the session.
Yeah, but that's for as we push for
move forward.
Yeah, so we need to do a little work on this, but the southern Florida in particular, with Puerto Rico maybe. That's a pretty small geographic area, but so is Mediterranean California, but it's so unique.
Also the fire context would be much different in the Southeast versus the Mid-Atlantic, the eastern side of the Midwest, whatever the Midwest is, and the Northeast. So that, the fire component would play a part into how we might separate these things out.
Yeah.
Fire in the Southeast, they're getting more used to fire in the Piedmont. It's still kind of a weird thing up in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic.
Okay,
Amy, did you have a question?
Oh, go ahead.
Hey, I'm going to take my hand down. But my question was in line with Greg's. In part 1, on that slide, we have invasive plant effects on fuels, fire behavior, and fire regimes, eastern and southern US. And that's the chapter that Travis and I will be leading. Whereas in part 2, where Steve Norman will be leading the chapters on northern and eastern forests, that's not consistent. And I'd like to see some consistency where we include, the eastern province and break it out into New England, Midwest, Southeast, Gulf Coastal, and then Florida specifically is its own bring your own flora situation. And, in both mine and Steve's world, we can bring in Florida expertise as well there.
How would you, if we were to break out the northwestern, I'm sorry, that's not the wrong one, northeastern, where are we? I'm losing my mind here.
Go down to there's
Northern and
Florida,
eastern forest, there we go. So
Okay,
how would you suggest we break this out over here? Yeah.
Well, since we're following, EPA ecoregions, then let's stick with that. But within those, we need to understand that we need to keep some of those titles consistent. That includes, the Gulf Coastal Plain, which is separate stories from Florida. Puerto Rico, in the Forest Service ourselves, we can reach out to IITF, our Institute for Tropical Forestry, and the researchers there as well, in how there's migrants coming in through the Caribbean islands. So in the northern and eastern forests, what I'm not seeing is the south or the southeast. And I think that these two chapters need to be not only linked, and I imagine Steve and I will be reviewing each other's work, but I think that they need to be inclusive of those regions. So, what I'm missing from the northern and eastern forest area is where's the southeast? Where's the south specifically, region 8?
Yeah, the one thing to realize is the southern third of Florida is not in this bioregion. I don't know what it's called, but it's a subtropical.
Right. The mangroves and
so
swamps and wetlands.
Yeah, I think we need to think about more. My sense is that this probably needs to be more than one chapter, and I think that we need to have more discussion about that.
Steve, do you have thoughts on this particular chapter area?
Yeah, I think it's a given how the West is so fragmented, it makes total sense to separate Florida out in particular. There's, the EPA regions are not the ideal way to classify this issue. There's two ways that are competing, right? You have the fire story, the fire management story, and then the ecological aspect of it. And in some ways, South Florida and maybe the coastal plain have similar prescribed fire regimes. So you might want to say, well, they could go together because of that special interest. But ecologically, in terms of invasives, they are a little more divergent. When you think about climate change and how it's all going to go together in the end, it makes sense to have the whole, that latitudinal east-west system there. I'm in the mountains. I'm at 2,000 feet here in the South, in North Carolina, completely on more like what you see much farther north in so many ways than the coastal plain. And so the eastern ecoregion is the EPA region that we've been talking about. It doesn't work that well given the pattern of fire. If you remember my first slide a couple of days ago, it's like the pattern of large fire, and it's consistent with the smaller fire and consistent with where we have prescribed fire and don't. There's a tremendous gradient through that northern forest, eastern forest range, and they're extremely eclectic. I mean, the longleaf pine story could easily set out entirely by itself, apart from Florida, apart from the eastern montane system. I'm not so sure about Arkansas, but it's part, it's because it's a little more interior, has a blend in that. And then of course, it's all those oak forests at the edge of the prairie that they tend to have the eastern problem, the eastern species and some of the eastern oak management narratives. So I guess it makes sense. But you move north into the northern hardwoods type. And if you remember from my map, it's very eclectic too. The upper Midwest northern hardwoods is not so much like the Adirondacks. At least it hasn't been. That might change. In the past, it was more similar maybe. given.
Yeah, perhaps level two ecoregions in that area make more sense, because I think that there is a coastal ecoregion that goes all down the East Coast that includes northern 2/3 of Florida, isn't there? I don't know, off the top of my head, I'm trying to.
Yeah, more or less the coastal plain.
Yeah, I'm trying to look it up on my phone.
If I remember in the 2008 publication, within the larger chapter, which was south and northeast and southeast, there still were sub-regional discussions.
Yeah,
that's an alternative to just parsing it out with more and more chapters to just, lump in that sense. But if you're going to do that, how many regions are there in the country? Maybe, I don't know, 3, west, central, and east. So, it comes down to maybe the authors that you can get that really can speak well to this. And what I'm still unsettled with is how this truly functions when it gets down to the nitty-gritty details as an independent thing that meaningfully carries on from the discussion, that regional discussion in part 1. There's going to be a lot of back and forth to have it ironed out, and to have all the regions be consistently doing that could be quite a challenge.
Yeah.
So one of the things.
Can I break in a little
Yeah,
bit?
Amy's had her hand
We
up
don't
for
have a
long.
lot of time left. One thing about this parsing, in the part 1, what's east versus west for the fuel regime? And then, because as person in the middle, not, a lot of times west and right at the Wyoming, South Dakota border, whereas our western part of the Dakotas act a lot more like the west than they do the east. And then along that line, is the EPA ecoregion approach the best, like Steve was getting along or getting at, is would it make more sense to group these by a pyrome type of approach? That because I think the uniqueness of this book is the fire aspect. So should we consider it more from that approach than from the ecoregion approach?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, Amy, when Steve was speaking, and just how I think we're going to have to constantly come back to fire, because we do have a lot of invasive species synthesis work that's recently come out in different efforts. And so the uniqueness about this is the fire piece. And so I was musing about how could we focus around fire regimes for this breakdown. It might not necessarily be dramatically different, but it would just be a little bit conceptually the way we might approach it.
I think the only challenge is that it depends on if we take a fire regime map layer like land fire or something like that. If the resolution is such that you have a lot of stuff embedded in other things, the local land manager is going to be managing multiple fire regime area within a management unit. You have multiple fire regime areas. They're going to want one chapter to go and say, how do I manage my area? And that would be more like from the standpoint of, the whole land unit is within the desert, go to the desert chapter. Whole land unit is within the Great Plains, go to the Great Plains chapter. So maybe another way of thinking of it is what best matches management units. And the management unit is probably within a single bioregion. So that'd be other way of thinking about it too. I wanted to go back to the discussion about the fire regime, the two of them, the east and the west. What about doing a chapter on herbaceous invaders and doing a chapter on woody invaders? So a chapter focused on fuel changes, fire regimes, fuels, fire behavior, and fire regime changes of caused by herbaceous invaders. I mean, would that be?
You're talking about in the part 1?
Yeah. Would that make more sense than east and west?
I thought about that because that would also tie to say Puerto Rico, where they have some of the same fire promoting grasses as Hawaii. So, and the theme being grasses and how they change and the differences between annual and perennial grasses and grass fire cycles. But I do see some value in sort of sticking with the sort of bigger comparisons in these two chapters of part 1, East West. We could have yet another chapter that would be woody invaders versus grass herbaceous invaders, and just contrasting sort of the expectations and the generalities that have emerged if you contrast woody invaders with grass invaders.
Yeah. That's kind of what I was thinking of it, but I guess maybe having them in 2 different chapters. The other question is if we, because we have bioregional chapters that are going to deal with specifics within each, whatever those, however we determine to define those. And so up in part 1, again, kind of like what I think Rima was pointing out was not how do we not have redundancy between part 1 chapter on Eastern and Southern US and then the part 2 chapter. I think what we're talking about again in part 1 is right up here, overview of key concepts and general overview of general dynamics that can be referenced and provide more, not so much giving a whole bunch of examples and specifics that is going to be in the bioregional chapter, but something which is more, overview of fundamentals and concepts. I guess the maybe more of a discussion with Rima, me, some others about, should this be 1 chapter? Should it be a couple chapters? How is it split? How is it determined? How is it split by bioregion? Is it split by 1 on grasses, 1 on woodies? Should there maybe there's just 1 big chapter since the synthetic chapter? I think there's more. I think we really need to think about this a little more. It might require us a little bit more time than we have right now, unless anybody else has anything else to chime in on.
I think we have a couple hands up, and I would just add that I think taking some time to think about fire management and how that's maybe also regionally broken up and where some of these concepts align with fire management and our invasion processes and issues that we've been talking about. So I saw Doug's hand up, I think before Adam's, and was there anyone else?
Yeah, Doug was before me.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. This is probably going to be a fairly complicated or in-depth discussion that we're not going to have time for here, but it just strikes me that we're talking about various types of geographies that are relevant. And again, not to add to that first part, but maybe we need to define those sort of political and biogeographical boundaries that are relevant somewhere, and acknowledge that there are overlapping considerations, and that there are ways to break these geographies out, differently for different sections. So it may be that some chapters can deal with things at a level 1 region, and others need to break it down into level 2 or level 3, or consider pyromes, or there's certainly a value in talking about the biogeography of the woody herbaceous field loadings across the U.S. I think all of these things are legit, but we have to keep it succinct and effective ultimately. So again, maybe some just key definitions and explanations of those considerations in part 1 are going to be required. But again, the details are going to take a little time to work out, I think.
Yeah, and then for me, the thought just kind of occurred to me that the functional type of plants, annual versus perennial versus woody versus grass versus forb, often affect fires, and you manage with them for being invasives differently based on functional type. Often, different treatments are kind of effective on certain functional types. and like, so maybe there's kind of like some alignment with the way you manage things for fire versus the way you manage them for invasiveness. Yeah, just a thought that occurred to me.
Yeah, that's definitely the basis that the prescribed fire is applied for management. It's the foundation of that, the presentation we did on that, that James did, and then with the and then yeah, the chapter that's going to be coming out.
Yeah, the fire manager is looking at vegetation through the lens of fuel. Fire is a poor botanist, right? I think that was said numerous times at this meeting.
So we have about 13 more minutes, it looks like. Any other of these pieces we want to maybe discuss in depth, or do we want to start having some wrap up discussions? Let me ask you, part 3, are there any topics we're missing? This one here, talking about integrating invasive plant management and fire management plans. Do you think that we need a chapter on the flip side, integrating fire management into invasive plant management plans, or is that not necessary?
You could just say integrating invasive plant and fire management plans.
And
like, if you do both in that chapter, yeah, 2 sides of that coin. Because that other side was kind of, and I think I sent an email about some of that yesterday about the kind of the fire management.
Hey Matt.
Yeah.
It's Matt Tremino. Hey, I might have missed something here. So you took out the post-fire invasives management. Can you just, I know I missed something. Can you just tell me what?
Yeah, what we did is we just started from the ground up. Because a lot of the topics, specific topics in the session didn't crosswalk exactly, very well at all, really, to all the, we want to make sure we weren't missing something in part 3. So we just started over with part 3. And post-fire, I would say that it's probably in here, in this chapter. This is probably the topic that would encompass what you presented and it would maybe build upon. Does that make sense?
Okay. I think of watershed management. It has a lot of connotation to it. That's why I didn't.
And this is these are just like beta versions of topics. They're not.
Okay.
But the reason I put that there is because traditionally a lot of bear plans were based on watershed management, and
right, which is part of the problem with exotic annual grasses.
Yes.
History. Yes. Have you guys talked about this? Like long history?
But you're right, and that's why I included it, because it's being done. It's a focus of bear plans, and I think needs to be addressed somewhere for the fire management community. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Man, post-fire invasives management without even thinking about the relationship to fuels is such a huge thing on this topic. I mean, it's a massive, it's probably the biggest, when you talk about annual grasses, I mean, the biggest thing out there is the Bureau of Land Management's ESR program. I mean, that is #1 by far. For many decades, many decades, it's been the biggest thing, and it will continue to be as well, right? I mean, the program's cut back a little bit, but I just wonder if, it's such a big entity in itself. I wonder if it becomes awkward to try to shoehorn it into it's being done for fuels, which it isn't. I mean, that's an added benefit, but they're not directly doing it for fuels per se. I mean, they want to, and then
I would agree with that. Matt, for sure. I think it should be a little bit broader in terms of post-fire recovery and restoration.
Yeah, the reality is there's multiple outcomes of managing invasives. I mean, you're doing this to for a variety of ecosystem services.
Yeah, I think this gets back to the audience.
There you go. I think you're on the right track there.
Of fire managers.
Yeah.
And the programs, fire management programs.
Okay.
So maybe more generally to be able to managing pre-fire landscapes, managing post-fire landscapes. This is, I think, probably still fine. This is basically managing burning landscapes. But I mean, this is a book or it's a publication on fire invasive management, and so I think that it's within this. So fire invasive management before fire, fire invasive management after fire.
Perfect. Great.
Yeah, that doesn't shoehorn you. Yeah.
Okay.
And of course, the actual title, it can be something different later, but this is the theme we're talking about.
Okay, that's great. That helps. I just want to this helps continue to be able to anticipate where how with this. But my other question for you probably already covered this, and I may have missed it, but you had mentioned that a motivation for this was updating the zoo, doing a 10-year update on the Zohar review, which tried to be pretty comprehensive in the coverage. And I got to say, when I was preparing for this talk, I was like, wow, I could talk for 2 hours and not do a good job of covering the hordes of papers that, the hordes of literature that have come out. And I'm just assuming here that we're not going to try to be completely exhaustive of the literature, that we're going to have to choose some sideboards, and we're going to have to rely a little bit on our expert opinion to just write this from where we stand as individual people with our given experiences.
Yeah, it's not a literature review. Okay. It's a science summary.
Okay, thanks. Great.
Yeah.
I think being synthetic, but I also think really trying to keep the fire lens. And so I like this discussion around removing fuels from the names of the chapters. I totally understand, and I like the landscapes language, but also of fire managers, really fuels, they relate to that language. If we start talking about invasive species post-fire recovery, they're probably not going to read that chapter, right? But if we talk about it as fuel, they might be interested. And so I think it's important to think about our audience when we use our language.
Yeah, I think yeah.
Except that a lot of people that actually implement the post-fire recovery and restoration aren't the fuels managers.
Yeah.
So I think we do need to be a little bit broader. I like the managing post-fire landscapes and managing.
Yeah, I like that too.
Landscapes.
ESR. Yeah, in there, Matt. So that's just it right there. Michelle hit the nail on the head. And one of the real challenges, I can't remember if this was discussed over the last couple of days, but one of the real challenges is that we've got fuels programs. They're in a different building than the restoration building, and they're in a different building than the range program.
Yep.
And
chapter 1 right there.
Okay. All right. So you're going to cover that already, but how are we going to, I guess the mandate to all these subsequent chapters then is to think about how we're communicating this in a way that goes beyond or goes beyond these stovepipes, right? So that's just the thing, is like the botanists and the range people are actually managing fuels, and so aren't the wildlife people, Yeah. They're out there planting sagebrush.
Management money to do it, right? They're managing fuels with invasive species money, at least in the Forest Service, huge pile of money for managing fuels, tiny pile of money for managing invasive plants.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, we've got a lot of insight to offer you, Matt, for that that first chapter. I mean, the last 20 years, so I can help you with that as a passive secondary participant.
Yeah, I think we'll have input on that one. It's a really good one. And I think it really sets the stage for the whole challenge, right? Of all these that we're trying to provide some guidelines for, and some, I won't say solutions, but some guidelines in the other chapters for the various topics in part 3. It's the context that all this is we're trying to work within. Couple more minutes left. Any parting thoughts?
Steve has had his hand up.
Frame on this.
Yeah, let me lower my hand. So what I keyed in on is fire management plans and the word strategic. And some of these pre-fire, post-fire questions, suppression, their tactics comes up there, at least on the previous, yeah, still does. Is there a place here to move above the fire management plan and think about the land management plan, or even the state action, forest action plan scale, which is a really tough one sometimes, but sometimes the fire, there's an easy tendency to drift a little bit maybe to the operational scale within a landscape, rather than the scale at which the invasive and fire problem seems to be emerging more broadly, right, sub-regionally, deeper landscape, forest, national forest, or BLM unit or national park level.
I've already made the recommendation that we don't focus that section on fire management plans. I found out pretty quickly in doing research for a presentation that, you just ran into the people working on fire management plans say, well, we're just stuck within this limited scope of what we are supposed to do, and can't do that. So especially a little email exchange with Lindy yesterday, we definitely see it's like a kind of a bigger hierarchical analysis of governance.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure out how to get people to get these programs integrated.
Yeah, we have policy, and I think some of that can be set up here. You've got policy, you've got regional planning, you've got local management planning, and I think we could probably somewhere here we set that stage, and then down here you can talk more about tools and strategies, perhaps. But yeah, it's an important one to because I think that will help people at different levels. This is the other thing to think about. People at the policy versus regional planning versus local planning, management unit planning. If we can make this clear where they fit and information that addresses them, that I think would be very useful. And that's probably where somewhere in here, especially explicitly between here and maybe the last couple chapters in this part 3, that we'd want to sort of address that. And so it's kind of a touchstone to kind of make a note of, to make sure that we are not just focusing at one level.
That area, I don't know, maybe all of them, but maybe that area in particular is going to be most directly connected to what the final NISC-WIFLIC paper looks like. So here's this multi-agency paper, strategy, whatever it's going to be. Okay, here are some tricks and tools we can use to help people, put this thing into operation at different levels.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're going to get booted off or anything, but we are at 11:40. And Matt, do we want to save a few minutes to talk about maybe a timeline, next steps?
Yes. So you probably figured out, if you're not already part of our authorship group and you're interested in participating, send me an email, tell me what you're interested in, and we can get you tied in. We're going to probably, with the authorship group, try to find a time next week to debrief a little bit, tie up our, take this back out of PowerPoint format, back into a Word document as an outline. And then that we can share as an update of where we're at for the task team meeting, which is the WIFLIC NIST task team meeting, which is a week from tomorrow. So that's really our immediate next steps. I think sequentially, I see this as we really need to, with an eye on parts 2 and 3, we really need to get into the weeds about starting to hammer out part 1 first. And we can discuss that when we meet. Hopefully a number of us can get together. I'll send out a doodle poll later today. And if you send me an email and you're not on our authorship list already from the folks that have participated in our session, I can add you to that. Anything else we want to hit for now? Well, I want to thank everybody. This has been great. A couple of months ago, maybe more than a couple of months ago, we were hoping that this would be a good opportunity for the Fire Congress to do these sessions and have this fire circle and move us forward on this project. And I think we've had some fantastic input. I think all the presentations I saw, Becky, I saw yours yesterday. I couldn't log in this morning, but great stuff. Best collection of stuff on the topic of fire and invasives I've seen in a very long time. So I think
some great talks the past few days.
Yes. So it's really appreciate everybody's energy and excitement and involvement in this. Got anything closing, Becky?
I don't think so. It's just exciting. There's a lot of new folks for me, and so and then some folks I've known for a while. So this is great. Look forward to working with everyone.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and we'll be speaking to most of you probably pretty soon.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.